Mahesh Bindra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of New Zealand First to speak on the drug and alcohol testing of community-based offenders and Bailees Amendment Bill. Mr. Speaker, this bill rightly amends the 3 Acts of Parliament in an effort to reduce crime, to improve public safety, and to hopefully reduce reoffending. A majority of crimes are committed while the offender is under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and most times both. Now, drug and alcohol abuse is more prevalent in our society, Mr. Speaker, than we would like to think. Tens of thousands of families are broken and children taken away by thefts, while youth facilities are a safer place than our streets, but they are not the ideal place for our youth to grow up. Foster care homes are only next best, and in the absence of parental care, our youth turn to drug and alcohol abuse when they are most vulnerable. Now, drug and alcohol abuse has also been identified as a major factor and a driver behind violent and sexual crimes. So, Mr. Speaker, we need to change the behavior of these offenders, and we need to break the cycle of drug abuse and crime. This bill, to a good extent, aims at changing this behavior, and that is the reason we will support this bill at the committee stage. But we'd also like to point out that this bill is not perfect, like most other things. The issue we have with this is that this bill is that there is inadequate sharing of information between the 2 vital departments of our law and order machinery, namely corrections and our police. Now, a very glaring example and a very live example of that was, Mr. Speaker, the Philip John Smith escape case, where a criminal managed to make use of that lack of exchange of information, and he made his way all the way to Brazil, causing huge embarrassment to us. Now, had the Department of Corrections and police been in a greater sync with each other, this escape, we feel, could have been avoided, and so would have the embarrassment caused to our nation. Now, there is an expectation in this bill that the Chief Executive of Corrections and the Commissioner of Police will work together to work out the modalities of this bill as to how these offenders and Bailees would be monitored in terms of their drug and alcohol abuse while they are in the communities. So there's a wee bit of ambiguity between the 2 departments, Mr. Speaker. One department at the moment doesn't seem to know what the other one is doing, and they're too shy to share that information also, which can be vital to manage these prisoners, the offenders in the community, and of course those who are on bail. So the expectation our expectation is that it should be a requirement that these 2 departments work together, and not an expectation as is in this bill, Mr. Speaker. So we wanted to change that wording from expectation to requirement. So, because in the absence of that requirement, there is room for ambiguity and there is room for confusion between the 2 departments. Now, this is not fair on the Bailees and the offenders who will be managed under this legislation, and it is definitely not fair on the victims of their crimes. So any room for ambiguity should be removed, and there should be clear guidelines for both corrections and police to work together to make this effective. We have seen this lack of communication between these 2 critical departments in the past, and we don't want to be the laughing stock of the world in case Philip John Smith is repeated again. There's a human rights element to this piece of legislation also, and we must not forget that. The victims' rights are paramount, but the offenders' rights also have to be respected. Now, being shoved from pillar to post is not fair on those offenders who are chucked out of jail, put in the communities, and then they don't know what to do with themselves. So the modalities, Mr. Speaker, we have some concerns around the modalities of how it's going to work. Whether the police are going to be managing only Bailees, and the probation or corrections will manage the offenders in the community, or is it going to be vice versa, or is there going to be some kind of distinction between the two? Now, the taxpayer pays for the testing and treatment of offenders, and there has to be value for money for the taxpayer also. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we feel that when the classification takes place for high-risk offenders, those offenders who have offended against the children, offended against women and elderly, should be classified as high-risk offenders, and they should be managed in the communities accordingly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Jonathan Young.